Hey, Cheyenne East. Back with another critique video. If you're watching this video, chances are you are debating the criminal justice topic in 2020-2021. If you're watching this and it's not that year, this will probably make no sense to you and not be applicable, because we're going to talk about the abolition critique, which is really only applicable to the criminal justice reform topic. So if you are not debating that topic, I would just suggest you end the video, and because you can find other more productive videos on the channel. So like all of these videos, we're going to talk about what this argument is, how it is actually deployed by the negative, and what the best affirmative strategy is in response. So let's start with the basics. What is the abolition critique? Unlike a lot of other critiques that we face, where there's a bunch of different theories, a bunch of different people writing, and there's various branches, capitalism, Afro-pessimism, state bad arguments. There's a whole host of those types of arguments. Feminism is another example. The abolition critique is written by a few people, but it is all aimed at one central idea, that the prison system, and to a certain extent the criminal justice system, is just bad. It's not an effective system, and we should abolish it. That's the principal argument of all of these authors, that we should abolish it and replace it with something different. So again, the applicability of this argument is very limited to affirmative arguments that are talking about the prison or criminal justice system. Hence why, if you've still gotten this far and aren't debating that topic, not going to be too much help to you. All right, let's talk about what the critique argument itself typically looks like. The link arguments are based around two concepts. Number one is reform efforts, because the principal thesis of this argument is we should abolish, and the failure to abolish is what leads to the impact arguments I'll talk about in just a second. So if the affirmative is reforming, like our affirmative on this topic of ending mandatory minimums would be a reform. It wouldn't be a total elimination of the prison system or the criminal justice system. Piecemeal efforts is certainly another link argument, that rather than just going whole hog and abolishing the system, you are doing piecemeal efforts to either abolish or change it in various ways. And then one of the primary link arguments is any use of the prison system, because most of the literature on this critique is aimed at why the prison system is really bad. I think, to be fair to this argument, the critique authors don't suggest that there should be no laws prohibiting people from doing things, or that we should just make all crime legal and live in a world like the Purge movies. Instead, I think they're really making arguments about why the prison system as the punishment mechanism should be abolished. So why should we do that? What are the impacts to this argument? There are two primary ones: racism and structural violence. Racism is the idea that the prison system and the criminal justice system is racist, that people of color and minorities are disproportionately sentenced, disproportionately harmed, and perhaps even disproportionately wrongfully convicted than, say, white people are. And so that type of a racist system, whether it's prison or the criminal justice system, is bad, because that perpetuates racism, which is bad. Structural violence, racism would certainly be an instance of structural violence, but there are impact arguments that are broader than that, about dehumanization, the harms of the prison system that cause structural violence beyond the specific form of racism. The alternative, very simple. It's abolish the prison system or abolish the criminal justice system. The slide does note that this can be done via a specific focus. There are alternative arguments out there that talk about abolishing it with a feminist perspective in mind. But at the end of the day, it is still an argument about why we should abolish. So what's the 2AC strategy in response to this? Unlike a lot of critiques, this one's pretty straightforward. So first and foremost, we should be making arguments about why abolition would be bad. We can concede that the prison system and the criminal justice system is imperfect. In fact, the affirmative on this case makes that argument that there are imperfections that we should fix, but abolishing prison isn't going to be effective because there's no real replacement. What do you do with murderers? You don't send them to addiction treatment programs like you would drug offenders. There's no real alternative than exclusion from society. So that goes hand in hand with both it's not going to work and it could produce bad things like letting people wander free that are violent and dangerous. Next is the argument that actually reform is better, that abolition is too extreme. Again, this is adopting the idea that there are imperfections in prison and criminal justice, hence why the topic is all about reforming those. And this, to a certain degree, is an argument why the affirmative outweighs or the affirmative is a better idea. But there are also some other specific arguments that we can make as to why reform would be better. Permutation. Typically, this is a go-to strategy, but it is a little bit difficult here because the affirmative will try to do some kind of reform, and then the alternative is abolish. But luckily, our affirmative of removing mandatory minimums from drug offenses, you can do that and abolish the prison system or abolish whatever it is the critique suggests should be abolished, because the affirmative doesn't take a stance on whether or not we should have other people in jail. So those two things can happen at the same time. And remember, the permutation only becomes offense if you make the argument that it solves better than the alternative solves alone. So that is a little bit difficult here because we're going to abolish, and so maybe you can say we're going to do the same thing. And I think you're going to have to make these distinctions based around, is it abolish the prison system? Because if so, abolishing the prison system doesn't do anything with respect to mandatory minimum laws, because those affect sentencing. So that would be a reason as to why doing both would be a superior option than just abolishing the prison system, because theoretically you could sentence people to whatever the mandatory minimum is and then send them, I don't know, to an island or whatever it is that the alternative would keep in place. And then finally, utopianism. It depends on the method by which the alternative tries to go about abolishing the prison system. But if it's done outside the confines of state action and it's under the idea of we can rethink, we can teach, we can take a stand in opposition, those sort of fuzzy, vague concepts that are everywhere in alternatives, then utopianism becomes a viable argument, because you can make the argument that lack of state-based action and pretending that it's going to work is utopian thinking that leads to destructive tendencies. So unlike the other critique videos, if you've watched those, this one's pretty short because this is a very specific critique with a very specific set of responses that likely doesn't do very well against our affirmative of eliminating mandatory minimums. But again, the message is always, if you made it this far, go read the critique evidence that we have, go read the critique file, become a master of that, and you will put yourself in a position to beat these arguments.